At Chipotle, we also have a playlist. Guacamole as it's being hand-mashed, the sizzle of adobo chicken on the grill, the chopping of onions and cilantro. We call our playlist Real. Order now. Chipotle, for real.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot, the politics podcast that likes to lower the conversational temperature and bathe your sweaty opinions in a cooling balm of calming chat. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, purveyor of political calamine lotion to rub on those burning issues that bedevil us all.
When the heat is on, crank us up and let us guide you to a cooler take on today's politics.
Grab that gelato, slap on the sunscreen, and join us for another Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex and I'm hot.
Easy, big boy. I'm Naomi and I'm glowing.
And I'm Kenny, and being Scottish, I've been walking about in a string vest since late January and now feel awkwardly overdressed.
Talking of uncomfortable situations, this week marks Keir Starmer's first anniversary as Prime Minister, but his Chancellor seems to be in anything but a celebratory mood. We take a step back to consider what on earth is going on in Downing Street, both number 10 and number 11.
And we'll cast our gaze further afield back to Ukraine, in fact, a war that lately has been pushed out of the spotlight by headline-grabbing developments in the Middle East. What now for Zelensky? And what now in the land of orange oxygen thief Trump? His big, beautiful bill is going to change a lot of lives one way or another, rich and poor. We take a closer look with our tame international relations expert, Arthur Snell. Arthur, welcome back to Quiet Riot.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Arthur, before we dive into the meat of the show, I thought we might tease our listeners with some news about why they might be hearing a little more of you in the weeks to come. Do you have any news you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think a few years ago you would call this a Facebook status update.
It's complicated.
Well, I think I'm about to start going steady.
Yeah. I think that's fair. So just to let people know that Arthur's brilliant Behind the Lines is about to become part of the Cooler Heads family, as it were. Quiet Riot Podyssey will be its little siblings, and we very much look forward to your foreign policy nous, much more both on our channel and also on Quiet Riot, because we'll do loads of swapsies, won't we?
We will. I'm really looking forward to it. It's very exciting. As it happens, I've only just done the 100th episode of Behind the Lines, and what better way to celebrate that than by joining the wonderful Cooler Heads family.
How brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Quiet Riot.
Watching the government trying to push through its welfare reforms in the last 10 days or so has been like one of those contextless memes of a teenager taking a run-up and then inexplicably slamming into a solid wall. You just wince and ask, why? Appropriately or unfortunately, it comes on the very week the government was elected with a giant majority 1 year ago. And it is in truth quite emblematic of how poorly it has wielded power. At least at home, its achievements in terms of foreign policy are notable, which instead of balancing things out just seems to make the fiascos at home even starker by contrast. Now, this is not a Labour-bashing session. The notion they are all the same is as politically illiterate as it is toxic. Nothing that follows is meant to minimise the good thing the government has done and is doing. Only last Sunday we praised its ambitions in terms of industrial and trade policies. Nor is it to deny the series of toxic fiscal snookers deliberately and maliciously bequeathed it by the Tories. The febrile and polarised state of the electorate, the hostile and jejune media environment that just seems to have a hard-on for gossip and crisis and is prepared to manufacture it. All of this is true, but there does seem to be some dysfunction at the heart of Downing Street. The images of a Chancellor in tears during PMQs are not the sign of a happy administration. So at the 1 year mark, it seems right to take stock, to wince and ask, why?
She looks absolutely miserable. Labour MPs They can point as much as they like. The fact is, Labour MPs are going on the record saying that the Chancellor is toast, and the reality is that she is a human shield for his incompetence. In January, he said that she would be in post till the next election. Will she really?
Prime Minister. She certainly won't. I'm really proud, Mr. Speaker, that in the first year of a Labour government we got free school meals, breakfast clubs, childcare, got £15 billion invested in transport in the North and the Midlands. With cutting regulation, planning and infrastructure is pounding forward, building 1.5 million homes, the biggest investment in social and affordable housing, and of course, Mr. Speaker, the 3 trade deals. Remember the ones that they couldn't get, including the US trade deal. On Monday, those tariffs came down. That secured the jobs at JLR. That's who we care about on this side of the House.
Naomi, what is the latest on Reeves as we record on Wednesday late afternoon? And now we're going to be recording an emergency addendum to this in the middle of the night.
Well, look, Alex, the ruling classes have it in for the podcasting classes. This is a well-established law. Look, what is the latest? The latest is that clearly Rachel Reeves was visibly upset during Prime Minister's questions. I was shocked as she appeared on screen. I could immediately see the telltale signs of swollen eyes from crying. I have had it myself many times. And then we saw the tear trickle down and then the mouth tremble, and you could see she was fighting back tears. Rumours then start flying around the place. The office issues a statement saying it is a personal issue. We will, of course, not be going into detail. Leave her alone. Then it emerges that there was some kind of altercation with the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, prior to going in, where he reprimanded her for not taking more questions when she was on the floor of the House a couple of days previously. And then it comes out that she'd already had some terribly bad news, and then Lindsay Hoyle basically tipped her over the edge. We don't know the detail at the time of recording about how much of any of that is true. What was notable was also Liz Kendall not sitting on the government benches during PMQs. She was stood at the side and was not there either. So rumours then start whirling that we're all in for a reshuffle imminently. Starmer's, had enough, and off the rumour mill goes into all of that. We have, of course, then had various statements since from Downing Street saying she's going nowhere, don't be ridiculous, everything's okay, reaffirming the point about it being a personal thing. So that is as much as I know at the time of recording, and I don't know whether Alex, Arthur or Kenny, you'd heard anything differently to that.
Just in case anyone has been on the moon and doesn't know about this, the events that precipitated this was the welfare reform bill that the government was trying to push through Parliament. Terrible bit of legislation. We've discussed it many, many times and all its various problems. And why are they doing it again? Just why? The interesting thing is that there was a massive last-minute junking of the controversial section on personal independence payments, and markets did not appear to react to that pretty much at all. But they are reacting to speculation about Rachel Reeves' position, although I have to note that the move is broadly symmetrical to US bonds. So maybe people are getting overexcited, but I looked at 10-year and 30-year US Treasury bonds, and it's broadly exactly the same rise. So, maybe there's wider stuff going on. But there was a little spike around PMQs, and then when number 10 came out and said she's going nowhere, that calmed down again. So here's a question. Is that a fear of instability, or, as Simon French suggests, that markets see any replacement as less market-friendly? Because that would seem to me to indicate that markets quite like Reeves, like the reaction to her possibly going and then her being defended.
Okay, well, if we look at the sequencing of what happened, the markets didn't appear to react to the extra spending that would need to be found.
Yeah.
Sorry, the extra spending cuts or tax rises that would need to happen as a consequence of the welfare bill changes at the last minute yesterday. They did change when she was visibly upset in PMQs today, which I think means that they are panicked about a new Chancellor who will change the fiscal rules. I think they've so believed that she is incredibly wedded to and committed to that policy of not changing them, that it surely is a reaction to a fear that a new Chancellor is coming and that they will have to, because they have so few options left.
And that stands to reason, because if you were going to replace her, you'd be doing it to placate your parliamentary party. So you're going to pick someone who is identifiably more on the left. And of course, the markets would see that as...
Or choose someone who at least would take a different tack.
I mean, they might not be more on the left. They might be, we definitely don't want to put taxes up, therefore we have to change the fiscal rule.
Yeah.
If you were Labour MPs, would you want to jump into this particular pit of vipers right now? I mean, what I mean is there anybody lining up who goes, do you know what? That's the very job for me in my career right now.
Well, I mean, I think if you are currently the Duchy of Lancaster and you're wheeled out to be the bad news Spox on the broadcast rounds, so you're already in it, you wouldn't turn down the job of being Chancellor. What we're not looking at is plucking somebody who isn't in government into the second most important role in the country. No. It'll be from, within an
It will be either
person.
A promotion within Treasury or someone quite experienced.
Exactly, who heads up a different department. And of course, there are plenty of young Turks waiting to be given the junior ministerial position that would become available once everybody moves up a rung within that.
Or it will be a change of tack from the Treasury, because I think something that does get lost in this conversation is that the Treasury is as much to blame as Rachel Reeves, actually. It is the Treasury that is philosophically completely wedded to this orthodoxy that has created this, I think, ridiculous situation. I mean, 1.5 billion, 4 billion. I mean, in the context of a 1.3 trillion budget is nothing, and yet we have somehow ended up in this weird situation where if a policy changes and it's going to cost 50p more, the Chancellor has to appear at the dispatch box and explain how they're going to find that 50p. And it just seems to create an endless churn of this kind of story.
I would
you
like...
can have broad principles without creating such a lack of flexibility for yourself.
But I don't think it's just the Treasury. I do want to say I felt incredibly sorry for Rachel Reeves. And I think you'd have to be inhuman to have watched that and not felt very, very sorry for her. And you and I have talked at length about the misogyny that quite clearly persists around any senior woman in British politics at all, but particularly Rachel Reeves, having labelled her as Rachel from accounts and all of those awful tropes that she's had thrown at her. However, I do think that my sympathy is limited to the government as a whole, because it is not just that Treasury orthodoxy that has boxed them into a corner. They have boxed them into corners needlessly on so many issues, whether that is around red lines on taxation, whether that is around red lines on spending, red lines on fiscal rules, red lines on Europe. They keep doing this, putting up these artificial barriers that then make it incredibly difficult for them to do anything and just learn the art of saying no plans to, rather than we will not. I find the political naivety and the lack of strategy on, social philosophy, around welfare bill, etc., etc. There are so many issues where they clearly didn't have any kind of plan, but they had rigid guardrails. And the combination of that is, as toxic as the situation they now find themselves in.
Yeah, they're trying to change everything without changing anything.
Quiet riot. If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
If we survey the policies of the last year that have caused sort of the most controversy, winter fuel, land inheritance tax, national insurance rise, welfare cuts, they all do lead to the Treasury. So I think it is easy to arrive at the conclusion that Rachel Reeves is just bad at her job. Not to take anything away from the sympathy one might feel on a human level. But I just wonder if there are alternative explanations, like who would do better in her position and how? That's the bit I'm struggling with, because it seems to me that there is both a lack of guidance coming from number 10 and a weird extra hand on the tiller coming from number 10, where they agree with her constantly in principle to do X, Y, Z, and then fail to back her up when the practice of that backfires.
Yeah.
Would that change with a new Chancellor? That's the question.
What's interesting about this to me is that we've lived through, for example, the Blair Brown years, where it was very easy to see the source of the friction. I mean, you could see it from space. And if you're as old as I am, I can even remember Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher, and you could see what the difference was. Whereas it's impossible to understand what Starmer's real sort of direction is. And so it's probably an incredibly difficult job, being Rachel Reeves, because you've got this fiscal rule, which you're doing because you're trying to be credible and not be accused of sort of, being Corbyn redux. But there's nothing that sits underneath about what is the vision for the country. And of course, here we are, political junkies, but none of us can say what Starmerism is or what he's trying to achieve or, what his big vision is, can we?
Oh, it's not just us, it's the backbench MPs as well. We've
Right.
known for months, weeks at least, but it's probably months, that there's essentially two different parties operating in Westminster at the moment that are called Labour. There's the government, the party of government, and then there are the backbench Labour MPs who've been unhappy about lots of things in recent times. My instincts are that this week we've actually seen a lightning rod for a lot of that discontent. Reeves is getting it in the neck because of, not entirely only because of timing, but partly because of timing. Also, it's a series of lightning rods because the awkward squad on the backbenches have seen an opportunity to, flex their muscles.
Yeah, but it's not just the awkward squad.
Yeah.
Fair point.
And that's what made this rebellion, I think, notable.
Meg Hillier, not
That-
known for
No,
being
no,
part of the awkward
absolutely.
squad.
It upset quite a wide range of people. But what surprised me in many ways has been the kind of venom with which backbench MPs have waded in. And that again suggests to me a slightly deeper problem. Like if you see what's going on your front benches on today of all days, then why stand up and flame the government on yet another issue in the same session with real slide-in studs-up energy? And so I think we kind of have to separate the MPs that are legitimately displeased and those that will never be pleased because Keir Starmer is not Jeremy Corbyn, essentially, or not someone like Jeremy Corbyn.
Or not Tony Blair.
Yeah, or
There
not.
is also that
absolutely.
faction
There is
within
also
it.
that faction. Yes,
Yeah.
that's true.
I tell you what, I'm kind of disappointed in Starmer for, and that's in the framing of the response to the briefings against his chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney. So he comes out framing it as bullying. I'm not going to stand for this. I will not allow, rather than valid criticism of an entirely failing strategy at the moment. And I don't think it helps him. And again, I just think it's this odd reaction. He sort of goes into the heavy-handed controller mode rather than the pause, reflect. Okay, actually, maybe there is something that needs to be sorted out here. You can't get rid of them all. You can't remove the whip from them all. You can't suspend everybody. And it's this sort of odd authoritarian reaction to people getting quite frustrated with the lack of strategy, the lack of vision, the constant missteps, the constant comms issues. And again, I get frustrated that Starmer just doesn't quite know how to be a leader in that moment.
Yeah. But is it possibly because his whole parliamentary career is remarkably short for someone who's prime minister, and not just that, but it wasn't that he's obviously been a Labour supporter, but he was, not involved actively.
I am sure that is a part of it, But then take what he was really good at and known for.
Yeah.
This radical young lawyer who took up human rights issues, who represented young people in the McLibel trial, again, took on the big corporate giant of McDonald's back in the 90s. And then you fast forward to now, that is so far removed from what anyone would have thought he, of all people, would have been comfortable with, that I don't think it is just the lack of experience. Something has sort of fundamentally shifted and changed for him, or that there isn't a philosophy there. And we have to believe him the first time he says there's no such thing as Starmerism. In which case, be a fucking good technocrat.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my objection would be that in many ways, like I said, when you see the venom with which people on his own side attack him, I mean, on a human level, it must be just horrific to be Rachel Reeves and know that your own colleagues absolutely hate you and want you to fail behind you, let alone the people opposite. It must be incredibly isolating. And voters are kind of doing a similar thing. So if you constantly barrack the government for trying to appeal to right-wing voters with certain policies, while also declaring that they have lost your vote forever and nothing will change your mind, I mean, courting right-wing voters is all that's left to them politically. There is no carrot, and there's never been any carrot. It's like people have been completely ready to hail Starmer as a failure and jumped the gun, in my view, very, very quickly to that position, and an intractable position. And then they get surprised that he's pivoting to a side of politics that they don't like.
I am no Kremlinologist with the Labour Party. However, my read of it was that in the Corbyn years, you did have, and they were very, very well associated with the campaign against Brexit, the resurgence of Blairites saying, we've got to take back control of our party. We should never have ceded it, right? But we can't do it in one step. So Starmer becomes the project, the soft left candidate who can win over enough of the Corbynite voters to stop a Rebecca Long-Bailey character or whoever coming through to replace Jeremy, but much more palatable to them. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is a pretty coordinated plan behind a lot of this to get rid of Starmer ahead of the next election and impose a more old New Labour candidate.
But won't that increase the rebellions?
I'm not saying it is a good strategy, but I do think that there are still some very powerful figures. I think they would quite like to replace Morgan McSweeney with Jonathan Powell, for instance, bring him back, at a ripe old age to be doing that role within Number 10. So, I don't think that this is something that we can point to the left of Labour and blame them solely for, because I think the venom is coming in both directions.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not. It's coming from all the people behind him in many ways, and a lot of it is legitimate. He gives them ammunition to attack him.
I thought the Observer article with Tom Baldwin was also quite odd, and for those that haven't read it, it was a long read last weekend, and it was Tom Baldwin, his biographer, interviewing him about Islands of Stranger speech, and he says that he regrets it, that he had no idea that it was a Enoch Powell-esque version of, how to deal with immigration, but that he blamed himself for dropping the ball on various fronts because of the pressure he's been under in his personal life, with the death of his brother, with the arson attacks on the properties that he owns, amongst other things, attacks on Victoria, that he gets very, very upset when the political enters the personal realm. And I'm sure he hoped that it would help garner sympathy, but I think A, it made him look weak, and B, was an admission of, I have dropped the ball, I have been distracted. So for those that wanted to frame him as not doing a good job, it actually empowered them. And I thought it was an odd interview to do.
There's an issue that everyone agrees that Starmer is a poor communicator. It is possible that a lot of people have underestimated how important that is because of the experience of the comedy cast of Tory prime ministers. But fundamentally, being a gifted communicator is is essential in modern politics. I don't think there's any way around it. And it doesn't mean that you all have to be like Barack Obama or Tony Blair, but you have to have something. And Starmer just doesn't have it. And I just wonder whether, I'm not questioning your thought, Naomi, about whether there's a kind of Blairite agenda there. But basically, if you had someone who is good at talking to the public and doesn't make them feel a bit awkward and sort of toe curly, he's obviously a nice man. You know, it's not that he's sort of creepy. It's just that he doesn't have that gift. But there are clearly people who are much more comfortable and would probably be able to manage these crises much better because they can talk to the public.
I go back to what I was saying actually about Reeves, but applying it to Starmer.
Yeah.
My issue is that I find it difficult to visualize who would be doing better in that position given current circumstances and how. Like, what would they be doing? The thought creeps into my mind that, you know, the reason why centre-left and centrist parties have been, you know, there's a pattern of them being punished across Europe, really across the world, is that it is impossible to run a compassionate government during times where there isn't a lot of money sloshing around. That maybe the problem is slightly more profound than that, which then begs the question, like, what's next? So I see a lot of what's going on from the backbenches, and while I understand both the sentiment and the criticism and agree with much of it, I look at the tone and I think you're overstepping a mark where you're becoming from a constructive critic of the government to an actual help
Enabler.
to the other side that we're
I agree.
all trying to prevent from getting into power. And that's not a place that I'm comfortable with.
Rated T for Teen.
Each year, thousands of adults lose their shred. It's an epidemic simply known as shred loss. But it doesn't have to be this way, because rekindling your shred is as easy as playing the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4. With new parks, cross-platform multiplayer, and sick new game modes, we can put an end to shred loss everywhere. Get the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and show the world that the shred's not dead. Pre-order Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and play the Foundry demo.
And now it's time for the part of the show where culture wars meet eye rolls and common sense goes on holiday. We find ourselves once more asking whether the outrage industrial complex is running at full tilt again this week. It's time, of course, for Wokey Dokey.
Wokey Dokey.
Alex, how is the outrage industrial complex this week?
Ditch Churchill from banknotes. What an orgy of virtue signalling. So, the Bank of England has launched a request for the public to give them some ideas about what direction they want the banknotes to go in. And they've said, basically, instead of always only going for historical characters to put on the other side of the note, we can expand it a bit. We can talk about landmarks or things that represent Britishness or symbols or whatever, you know, achievements, inventions. Cue outrage from all, literally the entire right-wing press. The Express has run with a headline, Bank of Wokeness. I mean, it's not even a good pun. Like, anyway, what I find interesting about that is that I'm old enough to remember when they hated the idea of Jane Austen and Alan Turing, you know, that was wokeness. And now they're like, ditch people like Alan Turing and Emmeline Pankhurst from our banknotes, not on my shift. And it is a case study on how wokeness kind of moves on, right? Because what the bank is actually suggesting is going back to how it used to be before Shakespeare first appeared on the back of a banknote, which is, you know, you had buildings, you had the Houses of Parliament, or, you know, you had bridges and lions and the statue in Trafalgar Square, things like that. So they're going back to
The good
the
old
50s
days.
and 60s. But no, they now want the thing that they condemned as woke 5 years ago.
Because I can foresee a situation where it's a bit Boaty McBoatface. If you ask the public what to put on a banknote, we could end up in a situation that Milan found itself in, where outside the stock exchange, a statue was to be placed immediately after the financial crisis, and the local people get to choose. And of course, they chose the finger. And there is this massive statue of a raised middle finger permanently now, pointing in the direction of the stockbrokers. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I wonder if here we were to ask the average person, the Bank of England banknote, what do you want on it?
The other thing they're all raging about is that asking people to contribute. But that's how the last round went.
Yeah.
You know, it was people that actually suggested Alan Turing and Stephen Hawking and people like that.
Who would you put on a banknote? I was thinking somebody who's achieved something, hasn't caused unhappiness, hasn't screwed up too much. Someone, Bob Mortimer, national treasure. Stick Bob Mortimer
Claire
on
Balding.
Claire Balding. Oh, no. She can go on a fiver. Bob Mortimer on a 20 quid note. That leaves you with a tenner.
So first of all, you're not allowed to have anyone living on them, apparently.
Okay.
The monarch on the other side can be the only living person on the banknote. And I suspect for good reason, because they might have been burning a big pile of Jimmy Savile. But if we go back to the idea of landmarks and things, like what's the landmark or symbol of Britain that you would have on there?
The empty plinth in Trafalgar Square.
The empty one.
The empty, not with one of the temporary statues on it, just the damned empty plinth. That sums up the last 20 years for me.
I like that. I think that's quite bleak. How about you?
I mean, I love the Angel of the North, and it gets me every single time I see it.
Yeah. I remember when that was greeted with absolute venom from all the press, and now it's
I love a good
total
sculpted bomb.
feature of the landscape, isn't it?
Yeah.
How about you, Arthur?
Well, I think, it's still the case that Britain's greatest contribution to global culture is the invention of the pub. It's still something that brings people together. So somehow an image.
And Alex?
The right-wing press seem to have got their knickers in a twist at the idea that it might be a range of Doctor Who's and a Dalek or the Beatles or something like that. But I would quite like something like that.
Okay. A delayed train.
Just an empty space again, isn't it?
An overcrowded youth.
God, your £5 note will be arriving in 10 minutes.
Really?
I mean, it takes the foreigner in here to be like pro-Britain. You're pathetic.
Well, thank you, Alex. And listeners, no doubt you're finding more Wokey Dokey stories on the regular. Ping them over to quietriotpod@gmail.com. Quiet Riot. And now we turn our efforts away from the domestic to the global. With international attention fixed firmly on Iran and Israel in recent weeks, we want to explore what the ripple effects will be for Ukraine, whose struggle against Russian aggression now risks being relegated to page 2. Has the West taken its eye off the ball? Has Putin just been handed a perfect distraction? Is this simply the reality of a multipolar world? Or has the West let itself become distracted at a critical moment? Meanwhile, in response to both threats, and indeed Donald Trump, several European countries have announced they'll ramp up defence spending to 5% of GDP. A huge leap for most. But what does that really mean for Ukraine? More tanks, more missiles, or homes for soldiers in the UK? And speaking of the Donald, fresh from the comfort of his golf cart diplomacy, he has passed what he's calling his big, beautiful bill to dramatically reshape America. It includes isolationist provisions, cuts to medical aid, restrictions on food stamps, well over $100 billion for border force policies, and more. Arthur, do you think the Middle East crisis has already begun to sap Western attention and political will away from Ukraine, or is that a bit overblown?
No, that's not overblown at all. And in fact, I think it started doing that much earlier than perhaps a lot of people imagined. As it happened, I was in Israel in January and I was talking to some aid workers, and most of them had been working in Ukraine And then post the October the 7th events, obviously we're talking all the way back in 2023, there had been this kind of gradual shift of focus and attention. So even from probably 2024 onwards, that's been the case. But clearly, in most recent days and weeks, the really dramatic events, both in Gaza and then around the Israel-Iran conflict, that has taken away some of that attention.
From a Kremlin perspective, Arthur, does the Israel-Iran conflict represent a welcome distraction? I mean, has Putin taken advantage and exploited this particular moment to push even harder in Ukraine?
I think he probably has, but it's probably worth taking a step back and looking at the trajectory of Putin's fortunes since Trump came back in. Obviously, Trump had claimed he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Nobody seriously thought that was a possibility. But what he clearly planned to do was to offer the Russians almost everything they could hope for. And there's this thing about Putin that he couldn't take the win. So he was being offered land in Ukraine. He was being offered Ukrainian neutrality, all manner of longed for dreams. But what he wasn't being offered was the extinction of the country called Ukraine. But what's happened since then is that because Trump has lost interest, there is definitely that sense that Russia can do what it wanted. So during the brief period when there were negotiations underway, when Putin launched major airstrikes, you had Trump sort of complaining about it because it made Trump look bad. But now that Trump isn't focused on it, in fact, the biggest airstrike of the entire war only happened 3 days ago. On 29th of June. So we're talking about a real transformation in the degree to which Putin can get away with this stuff. But the other thing that's happening is I think actually, whilst Iran being put under a lot of pressure, one might say that's bad for the Russians because they're allies, clearly. But that has caused the oil price to shoot up, and that's really good news for Russia as well.
And going back to Trump,
yeah.
Washington has decided to partially suspend shipments of air defense missiles and other munitions to Ukraine, apparently concerned about actually having quite a low stockpile at home at the moment, at almost the exact same time that North Korea has apparently committed 30,000 extra troops to help Russia fight on Ukraine's soil. As I understand it, to date, the North Koreans have mostly been supporting Putin's war effort in Russian-occupied areas. So are we at a moment where things could get dangerously bad for Zelensky?
Well, I think we are at certainly one of those moments where it looks very tough for the Ukrainians. This point about the Patriot missiles, which are the air defense missiles, and the Americans stopping the supply of those to the Ukrainians. I mean, that is another reminder, and we've had so many of these, of the degree to which Trump is really on Russia's side, because by definition, it's defense. You can't use a Patriot missile to attack Moscow. And yes, the American stocks will be slightly low, but really, who are the Americans defending themselves against in the short term? Of course, all countries need resilience, and that's something we've learned from the Ukraine war. The Americans have all the industrial capacity to make more of these missiles. So they're hiding behind this idea of low stocks. This breaking news about the North Korean troops, I mean, I think that would be really difficult. We have to remember, of course, that 30,000 troops, the Russians are getting through numbers like that in an average
1,000
month.
a day. Some days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in a month, they can get through 30,000. But of course, depending on how they're deployed, depending on what resources comes with that, that is still a major commitment.
And what are North Korea getting in return?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot is food aid because, North Korea manages to be a nation on the brink of starvation and armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons.
Well, 25 years ago, I did my dissertation at university on the economics of the famine in North Korea in 1997.
You were ahead of the times, but it's
now,
still relevant.
Well, I mean, look, it was Amartya Sen talking about, look, a shortage of food never causes a famine.
Right.
It's a lack of access to food,
yes.
Whether war, whether health crises like HIV, etc.
Right. See the potato famine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because nobody was publishing anything on it and you couldn't get into the country to look at it, I was having to go to the geography department and look at satellite imagery of crop failure over time, or trying to assess the the lack of access to food in other ways, and then some reports that came out of Japanese and a few Russian publications at the time that I then have to get translated for me. So, no, all fascinating, and yes, poor old North Koreans as well as poor Ukrainians.
North Korea. Can I just ask, what do we have any idea of what use 30,000 Korean troops would genuinely be? I mean, into the meat grinder, it's fine. As you said, you can burn through the bodies in no time at all. But do we know very much about the training, the kit that they would come with? Is there any of that sort of detail at all out there?
Well, what we know about the ones that came in the first wave, which was a smaller number, and as Naomi mentioned, they were mostly inside Russian territory in that sort of pocket that the Ukrainians had taken around Kursk, was that they were sort of elite troops. So they were special forces regiments. Now, obviously, one might say, well, what's an elite troop in that context? But they're highly trained and quite well equipped and probably well fed, which, is not irrelevant in this context. They're probably not going to bring with them heavy armor and those sorts of things, which clearly could tip the balance perhaps in a different way. So I wonder whether it is really just a way of Russia signaling to the rest of the world that it is not standing down, and on the contrary, it's ramping up. So it's ramping up its airstrikes, it's ramping up its kind of troops on the ground.
And in terms of Europe picking up the slack for Trump pulling away in terms of his support for the Ukraine effort, European countries, several of them pledging to raise spending to 5% of GDP, but how quickly can that translate into practical help for Ukraine, or even will it? And if it is destined for Ukraine, wouldn't we be better off just giving them the money? Let them get this job done.
It's a very fair question. I guess there are possibly two ways to answer that. So one is, for example, Denmark, I think I'm right in saying, no longer has artillery because it gifted the whole lot to the Ukrainians.
Good old Denmark.
Yeah, good old Denmark. And those guys have a history of real commitment to NATO and to European defence in spite of being a small country. But that's an example where it doesn't make sense for countries to have almost nothing. And the UK similarly, there are things that our stocks are right on the floor because of support to Ukraine, which all right-thinking people probably agree with. So I think we do need, not to have our own cupboards bare, but clearly the jeopardy is in on the battlefields of Ukraine, not at the moment in further west. So I think a couple of things worth noting, though, that the Ukrainians are now actually able to manufacture most of the weapons that they need. So as long as they're kept supplied with the resources, they can keep themselves well equipped. The difficulty is with one or two specialist items. Now, for example, the Patriot missile, which is not a new thing, but it has been the key NATO air defense missile for decades. And again, most European countries have already gifted most of their own batteries to the Ukrainians. So the challenge is, of course, perhaps people should have foreseen this, but no one really assessed the degree to which you'd have the pro-Russian president sitting in the White House.
But it's going on for so long because we've never given Ukraine what it needs to end it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair point. Now, so here's another example of how the Ukrainians end up being dragged into making awful decisions. Because they're low on Patriot missiles, they've been using their F-16s in the air defense. And that means they've lost a few. So they've lost pilots and they've lost aircraft. And there aren't many of those, which, again, it took years for the West to agree to gift them. Arguably, that was, Biden did many things right on Ukraine, but he sat on that decision for far too long. And now that they finally got them, they're obviously a very precious resource. So, yeah, I agree with you on the basic point that it would make more sense to sort of say, well, we'll get to 5% in a few years' time, but we'll start by giving Ukraine everything. The challenge there was that the 5% was the way to get Trump to come to the NATO summit and not leave in a huff or decide that Article 5 no longer worked, or, who knows what sort of... So it's this classic thing that we've got a series of not great choices and we're kind of picking between them.
Yeah. I mean, it feels to me like 5% is a ridiculous figure for the size of the UK economy. Yeah. Something like 3.5 would be much more reasonable and sensible. So to what extent do you think 5% is, well, we'll say it and get through the meeting with Trump without him throwing his toys out of the pram, and then maybe over time we'll never actually get there, versus a genuine commitment to ramp up to it?
Well, it's very interesting you say 3.5, because so what, as you'll be aware, of that 5%, 1.5 is not core military spending. It's sort of related infrastructure. And funnily enough, it's been interesting. I've seen slightly on the right, people who are perhaps a bit skeptical of particularly of European defense spending, sort of scoffing at this. Well, in the US, it's worth noting that under the defense budget, the Army Corps of Engineers does things like build roads and bridges, normal bridges, normal roads, dams, things like that all over the country. So there are plenty of countries that take civil works where we can all agree that, having bridges that can take a tank, ultimately, obviously, if you don't have that and your country in the worst case scenario is under invasion, you're in real difficulty. So that 5% number, I agree, is a colossal number, but actually maybe it'll pay for some, motorways or railway lines, which ultimately, again, as we've seen in Ukraine, are relevant in a sort of national emergency. So I'm pretty sure that everyone thought, well, Donald Trump isn't going to be checking the details of spending plans, and he just wants a big number that he can then claim he was responsible for.
And instinctively, what do you make of the claims that actually Trump really wants the war to drag on because it's in his interests? It gives him a hand to play that he wouldn't otherwise have. I'm
increasingly of the view that Trump wants different things from day to day. I mean, I think we saw this with the Israel-Iran thing, that on the first day he didn't want it to happen, but then when he saw it was going well, he wanted to join in because he couldn't bear not to be the center of attention. So I think he wanted the war to stop when he thought there would be a Nobel Peace Prize in it for him. And now that he's realized that Putin won't take the win, he doesn't care very much.
Meet the most capable CR-V Honda has ever dreamed of. The all-new CR-V Trail Sport Hybrid. With all-terrain tires and available enhanced traction control, it's built for wherever the day takes you. Heated front seats and a heated steering wheel, ideal for winter drives and crisp early starts. And with generous cargo space, it's ready for big gear and even bigger getaways. The CR-V Trail Sport Hybrid. Learn more at honda.com/CRV.
And I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. He has evaded Prime Minister's questions for 2 weeks.
We live in more volatile times than many of us can remember, with conflicts in many parts of the world that are evolving in a very fast and dangerous way. There's never been a more important time to work with our allies and to be absolutely serious in our response. That response was unserious. Unserious. To suggest at a time like this that the Prime Minister attending the G7 summit and the NATO summit is avoiding PMQs is unserious.
This morning, before we came in to record, Arthur, there was an announcement that the UK and Germany were progressing a kind of bilateral defence pact, among other things, around mobility of people. To what extent do you think that is about the common threat of Russia in terms of cyber war, rather than the hard war on the ground in Ukraine? And is that the right approach, to be doing some kind of bilateral thing with an EU member state to tackle all the things that we know happen, interference in elections, espionage, poisoning our people, blah, 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 blah?
Yeah, I think with Germany in particular, I mean, Germany is the country that is probably going to see the biggest sort of revolutionary change in its defence posture in the coming years. And yes, we all remember the Zeitenwende speech, which was obviously Olaf Scholz, previous Chancellor, but it didn't quite really materialise. Whereas what they've done now is they've literally changed their whole constitution so they can borrow serious money. And of course, Germany, even though its economy has not had a great run the last few years, is by many miles the biggest economy in the EU and much bigger than the UK economy. So if you consider the industrial might of Germany and it turns its mind to defence, it clearly there's a lot of capability there. Now, I think why this is important for the UK is that Germany has, as mentioned, the sort of industrial capabilities, a lot of technical capabilities, but also we do have to remember that Germany's own defense is incredibly sort of ramshackle at the moment. So it's that classic thing of, if you have a sort of grand house, you might have to spend £1 million just to sort of seal the roof and get the windows sorted before you do anything fancy on the interior. And that's sort of
Kenny knows all about that.
Okay, well, your lovely manor house is still being rebuilt. But
you'll hear me sobbing from the other end of the country.
That is the German. That's the German defence thing. So I think, again, we'll wait a long time before we sort of see.
But does Germany very much feel the proximity of Russia in the way that we potentially don't as an island nation?
I mean, I think it does. But of course, you've also got, in Germany, this stuff is much more politically contested. There's still, understandably, a very strong pacifist strain in German politics. And then you've got a pro-Russian strain on the populist right, the AfD. So it's bold. You have to give the new Chancellor Merz credit. It's bold to sort of seize this bull by the horns. I think the UK is perhaps also, in making this big sort of bilateral arrangement, is trying to show Germany that as the UK is seen as one of the sort of serious defence players in Europe, albeit one that, we ourselves have allowed our capabilities to wane over the years, that we're sort of taking the Germans seriously, because it has tended to be European defence means France and Britain, and everyone else is being ignored.
And now just France.
Yes, now just France, exactly. Now that we're out of the EU. So there is a need for other countries to step up, and clearly Germany is the obvious one.
Now, back to home in the UK, the Home Office is reportedly turning down Ukrainian asylum claims on the grounds that much of Western Ukraine and Kyiv itself are now deemed safe, even though many of those claiming asylum in the UK are from towns obliterated, if not now controlled by Russia. Some have had children since they've been here. They're very, very integrated into British life. So is it true that the country is safe for them to return? And if so, given everything Ukraine is having to spend at the moment in terms of military and defence spending, can the government offer them some kind of resettlement support in a totally different part of the country from whence they came?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, that there are the towns in eastern Ukraine are either under Russian occupation or rubble or both. Obviously, Ukraine's a vast country. We could talk about places like Lviv, quite close to the Polish border. Well, this massive Russian air assault, which took place a few days ago, more than 500, sort of aerial weapons flying into Ukrainian territory. Some of those hit targets in Lviv. Now, Lviv, unlike further east, it is largely unscarred from this war, but it's not completely. So we're saying that that's safe? I mean, obviously, perhaps.
And it's such a dynamic situation, as we talked about at the beginning of this section. With North Korean troops coming in, with the US pulling back from support, with Putin taking advantage of the world being distracted by other things. Yeah. It feels like a very dangerous thing to say, go off you go. It's totally fine.
I would completely agree. And furthermore, I mean, given the labour force crisis in the UK, I mean, it seems to be quite bizarre that you've got all these. I mean, this is all anecdata, but everybody I know knows a Ukrainian who's doing some extremely industrious thing here in the UK, and how our country would benefit from them leaving, it's not clear to me.
So let's turn to the big, beautiful bill that Trump is selling as putting America first again. What do we think it really means for low-income Americans? And, is this more jobs or just more pain? Let's have a little listen to Trump on it now.
Musk is ripping into this bill again. Are you concerned that Republicans are going to be swayed by Musk and his money?
No, I don't think so. I think what's going to happen is Doge is going to look at Musk. And if Doge looks at Musk, we're going to save a fortune. Thank you very much, everybody. I don't think you should be playing that game with me.
Mr. President, July 9th tariff guideline.
Kenny, Arthur, any views on whether this is really going to help out the average American?
Well, I think it's very bad news if you've got sort of chronic health needs, because that as we all know, if you're reliant on Medicaid, which there's a myth that there is no healthcare in America. That yes, it's largely paid for by private insurance, but for low income people, of course, that there is a safety net system. But that's the thing that they're trying to cut. In cutting that, then give tax breaks to high earners. There are things where there are costs that, as individual costs, don't sound incredible. Maybe it's $100 for a particular thing. But if, for example, you're on dialysis and you have to do that 50 times a year, you've got to find $5,000. And if you're on a low income, that's
Where
not
do you
something
find that from?
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and if you're too sick to work because of your
exactly. So
kidney issue,
and we've seen it in this country where, of course, we do have the NHS. Lucky us, but people who have certain health needs, particularly mental health needs that aren't being taken care of by the NHS, are getting stuck. And of course, that has become politically toxic just in the last few days here. So it seems to me that this is very bad news for Americans on low incomes, many of whom Trump flipped, as traditional Democrat voters flipped them to vote for him.
And this is a man who, let's not forget, amidst all the latest controversies, has launched his own range of colognes in the last few days, hasn't he? I mean, smell like Donald Trump. It's not the hard sell for Christmas that was on my bingo card, I can tell you right now.
I mean, I was reflecting on this earlier, and you just think of the sort of some of the great people who have been presidents of the United States, FDR, JFK. Can you imagine the sort of ask not what you can do for your country? Oh, by the way, here's my new fragrance.
Ask how you smell.
Exactly. It is just staggering. The cheapening of this great office is just staggering.
But I think that's my overwhelming takeaway. It's not so much the lack of dignity, though heaven knows there's a huge lack of dignity around the whole thing. It's the fact that we know that this is where his attention is a lot of the time. It's the butterfly effect. Trump's ability to pay attention to anything for more than 30 seconds seems bonkers. And yet he is able to work on projects that are going to line his own pockets. It's never been good news for the poor in America, no matter how you cut the history of Trump. And there isn't any reason to suspect that what we've got now is bad news for all of them as well. Let's not forget we still haven't seen the last of the tariff nonsense. The bond markets will be watching this. The ongoing cost of servicing America's debt is something that will impact everybody one way or another. And we know that proportionally poorer people will get hit harder than wealthier people. That's just how it is.
Yeah. And I think that last point about America's own debt, because this bill is going to add trillions and trillions to America's debt. And actually, that those who look at these issues much more closely than I do see that it used to be considered, that the U.S. government bonds is the last safest, thing on planet Earth. And actually, you had, I think it was the Bank of Japan, suggesting that they might reduce their exposure. They are literally the world's biggest holder of that debt. Not in an overnight way, the way the Liz Truss mini budget did, but over a longer term, America's kind of central role as sort of the last redoubt of the global economy could be undermined just by the sort of stupidity and selfishness
and scale.
Yeah. And it is quite extraordinary because on one level you can see that there's that kind of flinty Republican who says, well, the government needs not to spend money and we need to balance the books. But they're not trying to balance anything. They're literally just giving more money to rich people and then running up a debt to do so. It's quite bizarre.
And of course, the rest of the world's been watching this. And, we've talked before about how Carney foresaw a lot of this coming and was talking to the likes of Japan, the likes of Germany, to warn them of what was ahead and to warn them of the dangers and what impact they could have. Simultaneously, there's another ratcheting effect going on in China, which has been quietly issuing its own dollar bonds.
Yes.
And so we have this pincer movement, if you like, from allies and foes, both of them attacking America at its financial core.
Yes.
We're going to go to our call to action for our listeners, Arthur.
Yes.
And we're going to go back to you. You've given us some absolutely brilliant ones in the past. If people are worried about everything we've talked about in this part of the show, what can they do to make themselves feel a little bit less impotent?
Yeah. Well, I think, there are two terrible conflicts which are unfolding in front of our eyes. We've talked about Ukraine and obviously the absolutely ghastly situation in Gaza. And I would strongly encourage people, if they can and if they're able to make some support in that direction. There are, of course, millions of great charities. I'm personally familiar with the people that run Smart Medical Aid, which delivers medical aid to Ukraine. Right now they've got people on the ground in Zaporizhia under constant bombardment by the Russians. So that's Smart Medical Aid. It's got a great website, easy to locate. And then if you're thinking about Gaza, it's harder because, of course, the Israelis have made it extremely difficult for international aid to get through. But Médecins Sans Frontières, among others, is still operating there, and they are a brilliant charity and worthy of our support.
We will leave links in the show notes to both of those. Thank you.
Quiet Riot. Never have I needed good news more than today. So I look to Naomi with hope and expectation as it's time for Grin and Share It.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
It's a tall order, Naomi, but have a go at cheering us all up.
Oh, I can. It's such a good one.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh. So the UK, not alone in having kind of growing anti-immigrant sentiment, Ireland too has had its fair share of noise in recent years. So enter Hero of the Week, a Polish immigrant to Ireland who saved people this week from a burning building in Dublin. Tomasz Zareba was driving his delivery truck through the city when he saw a fire raging and a man covered in blood on the pavement, having jumped from the second floor of the burning building. Tomasz then spotted another person screaming at the window, afraid to jump, but with flames licking at the room behind him. And so with no fire engine in sight, Tomasz just didn't miss a beat. He reverses his lorry up beside the building onto the pavement so that the trapped man could drop onto the roof of the truck just a few feet below him, saving his life. Tomasz then waits in case more people were trapped inside the building who would then manage to get to this window. He had smoke billowing all around his cab until the fire brigade arrived 20 minutes later and thanked him for his heroic efforts. And Tomasz told the BBC, "I saw the flames coming up from the window and one guy was lying on the sidewalk. He had blood on his face. I think he might have broken both his legs when he had jumped from the building. God. Another guy was screaming from the window. He didn't know what he was supposed to do because he had flames behind him and a long drop before him." And Zareba works as a delivery driver for Eurospar, which is a continent-wide grocery chain, and its Ireland-based subsidiary have, heralded this wonderful staff member to the BBC and said that they were absolutely thrilled to see one of their drivers display such a sense of commitment to their community. So, Alex, there you go, a testament to the fact that not all heroes wear capes, and some deliver more than your dinner.
Oh, that's lovely.
Well done, Tomasz.
Thank you for that. We will drop a link, of course, in the show notes so that you can share this lovely story.
And that's all we have time for. As ever, thank you so much for joining us again. And please head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod to back us if you can afford a few quid. We've got another Zoom gathering for all of our wonderful supporters coming up later this month. So be sure to be signed up if you'd like to join that and fellow Quiet Rioters for a chinwag. They are always very good fun.
And thank you again, Arthur, for your company and insight today. Listeners, if you haven't tried Arthur's fabulous podcast, Behind the Lines, with a clear agenda this time, I can say that you'll find it on all the usual platforms, and it really is a fantastic show for anyone interested in the world of geopolitics. Arthur, we hope to be seeing much more of you very soon.
I'm really looking forward to it, and thanks for having me today.
And don't forget to tune in for this week's Sunday School when Alex and I will be mopping our brows and chewing the fat about whatever headlines hit us in the face between now and then.
We really do love all of you. Bye.
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 Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. and edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.